4 hours ago, cameras entered the hold of the Clotilda and recorded surfaces that historians had already declared explained. The ship had rested in the Mobile River since 1860. It had carried 110 enslaved Africans on the last known illegal voyage to the United States. It had been burned and scuttled to erase the evidence. Archaeologists mapped the wreck, recovered samples, confirmed its identity through fasteners and construction style, and published the record. The story was treated as closed. The new footage changed only one thing. It allowed the cut marks inside the hold to be measured instead of described. The detail that refuses to fit is not hidden. It sits on the inner faces of the ceiling planks and the frame timbers. The cuts are flatter, and the grooves are more even than the hand tools of the period normally leave. Stay with me, because the measurements that came from the three-dimensional model are not what a rushed hand-built vessel was expected to show. Do not accept the textbook account or the new analysis without checking the pattern yourself. The numbers are public. The footage is public. The only requirement is to ask whether the old explanation still accounts for what the cameras actually recorded. If you want to see the full measurement and what it means for other sites from the same period, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell. The data is already processed. The only step left is to follow what the numbers actually require. The Clotilda was an 86-foot Gulf schooner. It was built in Mobile, Alabama in 1860. The voyage was illegal. The importation of enslaved people had been banned for more than 50 years. The owner needed a vessel that could reach West Africa, take on a cargo of 110 people, and return without interception by naval patrols. The historical documents describe a ship assembled quickly with the ordinary tools of a southern shipyard. Adzes, axes, and pit saws were the expected instruments. The work was understood to show speed and economy rather than finish or precision. That description matched the economics of a commerce that treated the ship as a container and the people inside it as cargo. The Clotilda is the only known physical wreck from the final years of the illegal trade that can still be examined directly. Every other detail of that voyage comes from testimony and documents written by the people who organized it, or by the survivors who endured it. The wood is the only part of the vessel that was not meant to survive, and that still carries the marks of the tools that shaped it. When those marks refuse to match the expected picture, the only record that was not written by the participants becomes the one that forces the re-examination. This is the part most people walk past. The ship is known, the voyage is known, the burning is known, the wood that remains is still carrying information that was never written down. At first, the explanation holds together. A vessel built for one dangerous crossing did not require long service life or fine surfaces. The frames could be cut and fastened in the time available. The marks left by hand tools would be visible and irregular. That is the picture, the documents, and the general history of the trade support. It is straightforward. It fits the pressure of an illegal operation that had every reason to finish fast and leave no record. On paper, the theory holds together. The ship was a tool for a single purpose. The builders had limited time, limited resources, and every incentive to keep the work quiet. The problem begins when the actual surfaces are measured. The recent camera passes moved through the silted hold and captured long sections of the inner ceiling and the futtock frames. The cut faces on those timbers are straighter, and the depth of each groove changes less than the replication tests predicted. The transitions, where one timber meets the next, are tight. The overall plane of the surface stays flatter across the length of the timber than handwork on the same species of wood normally produces. That is where the story begins to crack. The answer sounded simple until someone measured it. Experimental shipwrights have already tested the claim. They used period-correct adzes and saws on oak and pine, matching the Clotilda timbers. They worked under conditions meant to approximate a shipyard, including different sharpness levels, different timber moisture content, and different lighting conditions to simulate work inside a partially built hull. The surfaces they produced showed visible chatter marks, more tear out along the grain, and measurable change in depth every few inches. The change corresponded to the natural shift in arm position and force on each stroke. Even an experienced worker produced more variation than the model of the Clotilda displays on its cleanest sections. When the same workers repeated the test after 2 hours of continuous work to simulate fatigue, the variation increased further. The time required to reach the evenness preserved in the wreck exceeded the build window recorded for the vessel. The hand could not hold the same line and pressure long enough without visible drift. But before the numbers from the model are examined, it is necessary to understand what should have happened to the wood under normal hand tool conditions. A pit saw or a handsaw cuts by removing material with each stroke. Each stroke leaves a small ridge or groove. The next stroke starts from a slightly different position because the worker's arm moves and the wood resists differently along the grain. Over the length of a single long timber, these small differences add up. The surface develops a rhythmic but visible wave. That wave is what the measurements inside the Clotilda largely lack. Once you notice it, the old explanation becomes harder to hold. The footage was processed into a full three-dimensional model using standard photogrammetry. Overlapping high-resolution frames from the ROV were aligned to create a measurable digital version of every visible timber surface. Every cut profile on more than 40 frames inside the hold was then measured by software that received no instruction about what answer to return. It was only asked to calculate how far each surface departed from a perfect plane and how much the groove angles repeated along each timber. The output showed that the average variation in cut depth on the cleanest long timbers stayed under 1.5 millimeters. Across 47 separate cut profiles, measured on the ceiling planks and frame futtocks, the standard deviation in groove depth was 0.8 millimeters. The maximum single deviation in any one measured pass stayed under 2.2 millimeters. In the hand tool replication tests, even the best runs showed standard deviation above 3.5 millimeters and maximum deviations over 6 millimeters. The machine was not told what answer anyone wanted. It was only asked to measure the pattern. A human hand drifts. A system repeats. The pattern it returned aligned more closely with guided, repeatable cutting than with the irregular force of an arm swinging a saw or an adze. This does not prove that specialized equipment was present on the mobile riverbank in 1860. It shows that the signature left in the wood is harder to produce under the exact conditions the historical record describes than the record allowed. The evidence was not loud. It was precise. The issue was no longer whether the tool could cut the wood. The issue was whether the tool could be set up and operated in the positions where the cleanest marks now sit. In a schooner of this size, the hole between the frames in the lower sections is less than 60 centimeters wide in places. Overhead work on the ceiling would have required the worker to stand on temporary staging or reach upward while braced against the frames. Maintaining consistent pressure and angle under those conditions for dozens of passes is what the measurements now quantify. A large mechanical rig would have had almost no clearance once the hold was enclosed. Hand tools could reach those surfaces, but holding the same depth and angle, pass after pass in those confined and poorly lit positions, would have required either unusual control or a method of guiding the cut that reduced the normal drift caused by fatigue. The issue was no longer whether the tool was strong enough. The issue was whether it could even fit where the work had been done. Under magnification from the high-resolution stills, the wood fibers at the cut edges show a cleaner shear with less crushing and splintering than the hand tool test samples. There is a narrow zone, less than 0.3 millimeters wide, where the cell walls appear compressed and slightly darkened, consistent with localized pressure and friction from a blade moving at higher speed than hand sawing typically produces. That microscopic detail turned a visible mark into a measurable signature that the old description of hand labor does not comfortably explain. From a distance, it looked like a mark. Under magnification, it looked like a fingerprint. History usually moves from rough to refined. Earlier vessels show more variation. Later vessels show more control. Inside this hull, the pattern appears tighter than the story of a last-minute covert build predicts. The Clotilda was supposedly assembled in a matter of months by workers who had every reason to keep the project quiet and to finish before detection. Yet the geometry preserved in the wood suggests either more setup time, better guiding methods, or a level of repeatability that the written accounts do not record. The past was not speaking in words, it was speaking in patterns, and that is where the timeline begins to bend. The Clotilda was meant to disappear. It was burned after the cargo was landed. Later impacts and possible deliberate disturbance further damaged the site. The fact that measurable surfaces survived at all already works against the intention of the people who sank it. The fact that those surfaces carry a signature of control that exceeds the expected handwork raises a separate problem. The only physical record that was not written by the organizers or the survivors is now the one that forces the re-examination. The result did not destroy the accepted history of the voyage itself. It quietly weakened the part of the story that described how the vessel was made ready for that voyage. If this measurement raises the same difficulty for you that it raises for the record, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell. The next set of models from other wrecks is already being measured with the same protocol. The data exists. The only remaining step is to ask the wood the question the cameras made visible. When the same measurement protocol was applied to three-dimensional models of other mid-19th century wooden vessels, whose histories also emphasized speed or secrecy, comparable low-variation cut signatures appeared on internal structure in more than one case. The vessels were built in different yards for different owners. One example can be dismissed as careful work on a single day. When the same geometry appears across multiple independent builds, the explanation has to widen. The pattern stops looking like an exception and starts looking like a method that was used more widely than the standard account described. One site could be a mistake. The same pattern in another place is something else. The mystery did not get smaller. It widened. The official story of slave ship construction treated these vessels as crude, disposable instruments. The evidence preserved in the wood suggests that at least some of the work was done with a level of repeatability that the crude label does not fully cover. Whether that repeatability came from specialized jigs kept out of the written record, from early mechanical assistance used quietly in the yards, from longer build times than the documents admit, or from skill levels that modern replication has not yet matched under the same constraints, the numbers require an adjustment to the old picture. The official answer may still be possible, but it no longer feels complete. The people who were forced into the hold left almost no physical trace of their own presence. The only record that remains is the container. That container was shaped by other hands under conditions of secrecy and pressure. The new measurements do not change what the ship was used for. They change what can be said about how it was built. The question now sits in front of the evidence, rather than in front of the documents alone. The evidence was not loud, it was precise, and precision is what forces the re-examination. So, what does the evidence actually require? One possibility is that the shipyards and craftsmen who built these vessels possessed guiding methods or access to equipment that the surviving documents do not describe. Perhaps because the trade itself was illegal and complete records were never intended. A second possibility is that the modern understanding of what hand tools could achieve under time pressure has been set too low, and that replication experiments need to be repeated with closer attention to the exact timber species, moisture, and joint types preserved in the Clotilda. A third possibility is that the signature points to a layer of craft control inside the illegal trade that has not yet been fully mapped or named. None of these possibilities erases the central fact of what the ship carried or what the voyage cost. They only change how the container that made the voyage possible is understood. The cameras did not enter the hold to rewrite the history of the slave trade. They entered to document what remained. What they recorded is now asking whether the history that was written without these measurements is still complete. If that question matters to you, leave your view in the comments. The clearest observations often come from people who examine the same numbers without a prior conclusion. And if you want the continuing examination of what other wrecks and other records are still holding back, subscribe and tap the bell. The pattern is larger than one river bottom. The next surfaces are already waiting to be measured.